You are standing on a flat stretch of pale sand on the eastern edge of Gari, the largest sand island on Earth. The surf breaks over shallow sandbars 200 meters out, throwing up a fine salt mist that settles on coastal banksias. Nothing about the scene suggests instability. It looks like an ancient, permanent barrier holding back the South Pacific Ocean. Then the survey markers tell a different story. This entire ribbon of sand is moving. Every year, millions of tons of sediment roll northward along the coast, swallowing forests, exposing shipwrecks, and shifting the shore by meters in a single season. What is remarkable is not that a sand island moves, but that for more than a century of official cartography, state surveyors mapped these coastlines as fixed, permanent boundaries. How does a landmass 3 times the size of Singapore quietly walk across the ocean floor without anyone noticing until maps stop matching the ground? Later in this investigation, we will see a coastal town where every timber house was dismantled, floated across a tidal strait on empty drums, and rebuilt on the mainland, and an ocean boundary where 2 continental currents collide with enough force to alter local water temperatures by 15 degrees in less than 2 kilometers. For generations, the standard assumption was simple. The Australian coastline was a settled, ancient frame surrounding a dry interior. The granite headlands of the Great Dividing Range have stood for hundreds of millions of years, and charts published by Royal Navy hydrographers appeared absolute. But where hard rock ends and coastal sand systems begin, that assumption breaks apart completely, the lighthouse swallowed by the sand. Standing on the high dunes of the Great Sandy region, the Sandy Cape Light on the northern tip of Gari was constructed in 1870 out of prefabricated cast iron segments imported from England. Rising 37 meters above the tree line, it was built to guide timber traders and coastal steamers through treacherous shoals in Queensland waters. When the Queensland colonial government erected the tower, engineers placed it more than 400 meters back from the active erosion face. By the late 20th century, the South Pacific had consumed nearly 300 meters of that buffer. Shifting parabolic dunes, massive hills of bare sand driven by prevailing southeasterly trade winds, began marching inland at up to 5 meters a year. Rather than dropping into the sea, the lighthouse faced an opposite threat, being completely buried by a wall of wind-blown quartz. State maritime authorities and engineering teams had to construct extensive timber sand traps, revegetate surrounding blowout zones with spinifex, and continuously modify access structures simply to keep the focal plane visible above rising sand. It stands as a stark physical record. On a sand coast, a structure does not stay in one place relative to the ground around it, because the ground itself is on the move. The graveyard of Bass Strait. Most visitors see the southern beaches of King Island as a picturesque backdrop for local dairy farms. Sailors in the 19th century saw a death trap sitting directly in the middle of the roaring 40s. Bass Strait is one of the densest shipwreck zones in the southern hemisphere. More than 800 vessels have been confirmed lost within these narrow, shallow waters between Victoria and Tasmania, with maritime historians estimating actual losses exceed 1,100 since the first recorded disaster in 1797. The bottleneck created by the King Island coastline forced sailing ships completing the long voyage from Europe, known as thread-the-needle navigation, into a narrow gap of reef-strewn water barely 80 kilometers wide. In 1845, the emigrant ship Cataraqui struck jagged, kelp-covered reefs off the island's west coast during a northwest gale. Of the 423 people on board, 399 perished in a single afternoon within 200 meters of shore. It remains the worst civil maritime disaster in Australian history. The concentration of iron hulls, timber ribs, and lost cargo along this coastline is so dense that Geoscience Australia survey vessels mapping the seafloor with multi-beam sonar still regularly locate unrecorded wrecks buried in the mobile seabed, the wild horses that outlasted the timber camps. Deep within the paperbark swamps and coastal dunes of Sandy Cape, small bands of wild horses move through the heathland. These are the brumbies of Kagari, descendants of horses brought to the island in the late 19th century by timber merchants and pastoralists extracting Fraser Island satinay and kauri pine. When logging operations ceased, the horses remained. Genetic sampling conducted by university researchers confirmed that these isolated herds retain distinct traits from early Australian whaler stock, hardy cavalry horses bred for dry conditions and stamina. To survive in an environment with virtually no standing fresh water, these animals developed a precise behavioral adaptation. They use their hooves to excavate shallow pits in sand blowouts, tapping into the upper layer of rainwater floating on top of salt water beneath the surface. While public attention often focuses on the island's native dingo population, these feral herds have occupied the sand dunes for well over a century, living in total isolation on coarse dune grasses and brackish seepages. The coastal hideout where the Strait's pirates vanished. Long before colonial authorities established formal ports along the southern coast, the labyrinthine channels, hidden coves, and granite islands of Bass Strait were controlled by sealers, escaped convicts, and coastal pirates known locally as Straitsmen. During the early 1800s, figures such as John Baker and the bushranger Michael Howe used uncharted inlets of Wilson's Promontory and the Furneaux Group as staging bases to ambush coastal traders carrying wool, sealskins, and government stores. The shallow draft of their small whaleboats allowed them to retreat across treacherous tidal mudflats and into hidden saltwater estuaries where heavy Royal Navy cutters could not follow without running hard aground. At places like Refuge Cove and Sealers Cove, entire shore camps operated for years completely outside the knowledge or reach of colonial administration in Sydney or Hobart. When government vessels finally mounted punitive expeditions in the 1820s, they found abandoned timber huts, iron cauldrons, and crude slipways, but the men had simply dissolved into dense coastal rainforests and unmapped islands, leaving behind hidden anchorages that still bear their names on modern hydrographic charts, where two ocean systems slam together. Stand at Cape Leeuwin on the southwestern tip of Western Australia, and the ocean surface looks like a turbulent churn of white water. Beneath that surface, two of the planet's most immense marine systems collide head-on. From the north comes the Leeuwin Current, a tropical stream of warm, low-salinity water pushed down the Western Australian coast by atmospheric pressure systems. From the south and west comes the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, driving freezing, nutrient-dense water out of the Southern Ocean. Where these two continental-scale water masses meet off the Cape, oceanographic measurements recorded by CSIRO reveal extraordinary gradients. Water temperatures can drop by up to 12 degrees Celsius across less than 3 nautical miles. This thermal boundary acts as a massive ecological engine. The sudden upwelling of cold, nutrient-rich water creates a feeding zone that attracts humpback whales, bluefin tuna, and deep-diving seabirds by the thousands. Yet that same collision generates unpredictable, steep-sided ocean swells and sudden sea fogs that have caught mariners off guard for over 3 centuries. The town that floated across the Sound. On the low-lying coast of central Queensland, near the entrance to Broad Sound, there once stood a thriving township built to service the local timber and maritime trade. Established in the late 19th century, the settlement contained timber cottages, a store, and a local hall built directly on coastal sandflats behind the primary dune. In March 1918, a Category 4 tropical cyclone crossed the coast at high tide. A storm surge swept clean over the barrier dune, submerging the entire township under 2 meters of salt water and scouring away foundational sand. Residents recognized that the shoreline was permanently altered and dune protection was gone. Rather than rebuilding on unstable coast, the community made an extraordinary decision. They dismantled their homes timber by timber, numbered the wall frames, and loaded structures onto flat-bottomed timber barges and oil drum rafts. Over the following 6 months, residents floated their entire town across the tidal channel to high ground on the mainland. Today, nothing remains on the original site except scattered mangrove roots and tidal mud. The original town site exists only as an empty coordinate on old parish maps, the forgotten surfmen of the southern reefs. In the late 19th century, the Victorian Life-Saving Service established remote rocket and lifeboat stations along the rugged shipwreck coast to rescue survivors from stranded vessels. Among these crews were First Nations maritime workers and local fishermen, whose extraordinary knowledge of surf dynamics was routinely called upon during winter gales. When the ironbark Loch Ard smashed against cliffs at Port Campbell in June 1878, local station workers and Aboriginal trackers navigated vertical limestone cliffs in pitch darkness to reach 2 surviving teenagers washed into a sea cave. Using basic rope hawsers and heavy timber tripods, the rescue team hauled survivors up a 30-meter sheer cliff face through heavy spray. Despite performing dozens of hazardous rescues along this unforgiving coast, contributions of these local indigenous surfmen were largely omitted from official government reports of the era, which prioritized narratives of imperial heroism. It took more than a century for state historical archives and regional museums to formally record the names and rescue records of First Nations men who continuously risked their lives in Southern Ocean surf. The sandbar that eats ships 20 kilometers offshore. That thermal and physical collision off the Australian coast does not merely create rough surface water, it builds a massive, hidden topographic structure on the seabed. Where major ocean currents meet along the continental shelf, they drop millions of tons of suspended sediment into a vast, shifting underwater ridge known as the Breaksea Shoals, extending up to 22 kilometers into open ocean. In waters averaging 30 meters in depth, these mobile sandbanks rise to within less than 2 meters of the surface, creating an invisible barrier in what appears to be open sea. Hydrographic surveys conducted by Geoscience Australia reveal that southwest winter storms shift these sand bodies so rapidly that chart bathymetry published in one decade can be wildly inaccurate the next. In January 1921, a three-masted wooden schooner was discovered hard aground on these outer shoals, her sails set and food remaining on the cabin table, yet not a single crew member was ever found. Multiple state and federal maritime investigations failed to establish whether the crew attempted to launch lifeboats into breakers or were swept off by a rogue wave. The shifting nature of the seabed made erecting fixed steel lighthouses on the outer reef impossible, forcing maritime authorities to anchor manned lightships in deep water offshore for more than 70 years. The coastal dialect preserved on an isolated sandbar. On isolated settlements of the Furneaux Group in Bass Strait, reachable only by small regional ferry or charter aircraft, the local population speaks with a cadence that frequently startles linguists and visitors. Known locally as the island brogue, it retains structural elements, vocabulary and vowel shifts that sound remarkably distinct from mainland Australian English. When sealers, emancipists and First Nations families established permanent communities on Cape Barren and Flinders Islands in the early 1800s, geographic isolation froze specific linguistic traits of 19th century English and Maritime Pidgin in place. Words like momic, meaning to harass or exhaust, trace directly back to early English dialects that had largely vanished from mainland urban centres by 1850. Linguists from the Australian National University who documented island speech estimate fewer than 80 fluent speakers of the traditional island dialect remain today. As summer tourism increases and air transport links strengthen, this distinct acoustic pocket of 19th century maritime history is rapidly fading into regional uniformity. The ironclad wreck that established Australia's marine park network. Most maritime histories focus on brief, dramatic battles of 19th century iron ships, but few trace where those foundational hull designs ultimately came to rest. In December 1862, early iron-hulled steam vessels were deployed across global trade routes, testing absolute limits of naval architecture in heavy southern swells. The steamship HMVS Cerberus, an ironclad breastwork monitor imported by the Victorian colonial government in 1870 to guard Port Phillip, represented a turning point in coastal defence design. Low in the water and top-heavy, these early iron structures rode barely a metre above the waterline, making them highly vulnerable in open ocean conditions. After decades of service, the vessel was scuttled in 1926 at Half Moon Bay to serve as a breakwater, where its exposed iron superstructure slowly collapsed into the bay. When federal authorities began drafting formal marine protection frameworks in the late 20th century, the archaeological significance of this submerged hull prompted new legislative protections under the Historic Shipwrecks Act 1976. Legal mechanisms developed to protect the Cerberus became the structural template for managing submerged heritage and marine sanctuaries right across Australia's maritime jurisdiction. The tallest active dune on the east coast, rising directly behind beachside settlements of the Great Sandy region, is a geological anomaly that appears entirely out of place, a mountain of bare, moving sand reaching over 90 metres above sea level. With no vegetation or root systems holding it down, this massive parabolic dune system shifts under atmospheric pressure. Geologists refer to these structures as active blowouts. Ask a Queensland Parks and Wildlife Ranger for the exact elevation of the main crest, and you will not receive a static number, because height fluctuates continually across seasons. Strong southeasterly trade winds in winter push thousands of tons of sand northwestward, while summer sea breezes reverse movement, causing the dune face to march across coastal heathland and bury entire stands of scribbly gum forest. In 1973, commercial sand mining interests brought heavy earth-moving equipment to extract valuable rutile and zircon from the dune core. A sustained community campaign led by local conservationists physically blocked operations, leading directly to landmark legal decisions that protected the entire sandmass within a national park. The flight tests that relied on coastal gales. Historical plaques across the country record early aviation milestones in major capital cities, but crucial aerodynamics tests enabling controlled powered flight in Australia occurred on desolate, wind-swept sand dunes along the southern coast. In the early 1900s, pioneer aviators seeking to test early glider designs wrote to the Commonwealth Meteorological Bureau requesting data on the windiest, most unpopulated coastal dune systems in the nation. The Bureau pointed them directly to vast sandhills of the southern coastline, where reliable onshore gales provided continuous aerodynamic lift. Innovators needed predictable winds to lift crude canvas wings, soft sand to absorb inevitable impacts, and isolation from urban crowds. Hundreds of unpowered test glides were conducted off these high sand crests before internal combustion engines were ever fitted to an airframe. The exact same fierce coastal winds that made these waters a graveyard for 19th century shipping provided precise atmospheric conditions required for humanity to conquer the air. The ocean crossroads where 5 species meet. There are 5 distinct species of marine turtle inhabiting southern oceans: loggerhead, green, leatherback, hawksbill, and critically endangered flatback turtles, which nest nowhere else on Earth except the Australian continental shelf. Every single one of these species has been documented returning to nest on wide sand beaches of the Great Sandy region and Capricorn Coast. Mon Repos and adjacent barrier beaches represent one of few concentrated coastal zones in the southern hemisphere where all 5 species have been scientifically recorded. This concentration occurs not simply because sand quality is suitable, but because offshore collision of ocean currents acts as an immense biological navigation marker. Researchers from the Queensland Department of Environment and Science have monitored these nesting sites continuously since 1968. The thermal boundary formed by Leeuwin and East Australian currents creates a vast highway of nutrient-rich water guiding sea turtles across thousands of kilometres of open ocean back to the exact strip of sand where they hatched decades earlier. The tidal inlet born in a single night. Examine a topographical map of southern barrier islands and you will see sudden, deep gaps connecting open sea to calm estuarine sounds behind. These inlets look like permanent geographical features, but many were created in hours. In September 1846, a Category 5 tropical cyclone crossed the coast, driving a massive storm surge clean across the narrow sand barrier. Families living along the coastal strip woke the next morning to find that the ocean had carved a brand new channel hundreds of meters wide straight through sand, ripping ancient tea tree forests out by their roots. Named Jumpin' Inlet, this sudden gap split North and South Stradbroke Islands into 2 separate landmasses overnight. Hydrographic monitoring confirms the channel has never stopped moving. Driven by powerful tidal currents, the inlet migrates along the coast at several meters every year, continually eroding old shorelines and undermining coastal infrastructure. The rescue in a sea of burning fuel. In August 1918, during the height of the First World War, the German auxiliary cruiser Wolf operated covertly in Australian waters, laying naval mines directly across commercial shipping lanes off the New South Wales coast. When the merchant vessel SS Cumberland struck a mine off Gabbo Island, her hull was breached, spilling tons of combustible cargo and fuel into the ocean. The floating slick ignited instantly, turning square kilometres of sea surface into a roaring wall of fire, with surviving crew members trapped in the water amidst flames. Volunteer surfmen and local lighthouse keepers launched a heavy timber rowing lifeboat directly into the burning slick. Soaking canvas sacks in seawater to shield faces from intense thermal radiation, the 6-man crew rowed through gaps in flaming oil, pulling 36 survivors from the water. For extraordinary bravery, the crew received rare civil gallantry honours, marking one of the most remarkable open-sea rescues in Australian maritime history. Where the coastal highway becomes open surf. At the far northern tip of the Colula coast, the bitumen highway abruptly terminates at a wide sand cutting. Beyond this point, there are no paved roads, traffic signals, or concrete bridges. The open ocean beach itself serves as designated public highway. Hundreds of residents and visitors travel daily along 75 Mile Beach on K'gari, where the sand surface is gazetted as a formal state road, subject to standard road rules, speed limits, and police patrols. Emergency services, postal delivery vehicles, and supply trucks all operate on 4-wheel drive chassis, timing movements precisely around twice-daily high tides. This beach highway provides access to isolated townships that remained completely unlinked to the state grid until the late 20th century. It remains one of few places on the continent where long-distance transit relies entirely on temporary firmness of low-tide sand. The pirate flagship sitting in 6 meters of water. When people picture historic shipwrecks, they imagine deep ocean trenches miles beneath the surface, far beyond reach of daylight. Actual resting places of famous coastal raiders along the Australian shelf are surprisingly shallow. During the early 19th century, armed merchantmen and privateers operated across the Tasman Sea, preying on colonial shipping networks. In 1817, a heavily armed vessel carrying contraband cargo ran aground on a shifting sandbar near the mouth of a coastal estuary, settling in barely 6 meters of water less than 2 kilometers from mainland shore. For more than a century and a half, the submerged hull sat buried beneath a protective layer of mobile sand, virtually unnoticed by passing coastal traffic. It was not until 1996, when a severe winter swell stripped away 3 meters of sediment, that marine archaeologists from the State Museum located timber ribs, iron fasteners, and cast iron cannons, bringing to light a forgotten chapter of early Australian maritime conflict, the invisible freshwater dome beneath the sand. On a narrow island composed entirely of sand and surrounded by salt water, a fundamental hydrogeological question arises. Where does fresh water come from to support dense coastal rainforests and human habitation? The answer lies in an invisible phenomenon known as a freshwater lens. When rain falls onto porous quartz sand, it rapidly soaks downward without forming surface rivers. Because fresh water is slightly less dense than seawater, it floats on top of the underlying saltwater table, forming a subterranean dome of drinkable water extending deep beneath the island's surface. Hydrological studies conducted by CSIRO confirm that for every meter the sand table rises above sea level, the freshwater lens extends approximately 40 meters down into the sand matrix. This vast underground reservoir sustains perched freshwater lakes, such as Lake Bumangin on Kagari, which sit high above sea level on impervious layers of decayed organic matter and sand, completely isolated from ocean water surrounding the island. How did ancient First Nations communities and early colonial surveyors read these subtle shifts in sand and water to survive on a coast that was continually erasing itself? The legal battle that locked away 70 kilometers of coastline. In 1971, when sand mining operations were stripping thousands of tons of heavy mineral sands from dune systems along the east coast, a landmark decision changed the trajectory of Australian environmental law. The Commonwealth Government, following geological assessments by the Bureau of Mineral Resources, predecessor to Geoscience Australia, and fierce public advocacy, moved to incorporate the entirety of Kagari into a protected national park framework. The protected area covered over 180,000 hectares, shutting down multi-million-dollar commercial dredging operations and preserving fragile dune topography. It was the first time in Australian history that federal export controls were used directly to halt mineral extraction on environmental grounds. The decision established a legal precedent protecting Australian barrier islands from industrial-scale alteration. It showed that preserving a shifting sand mass required intervention long before dunes were stripped to bedrock. The shallow sound that became a global windsurfing destination. Turn away from roaring surf on the ocean side of barrier islands, and you face a completely different environment: Hervey Bay and Great Sandy Strait. This massive, sheltered body of water covers hundreds of square kilometres between the island sandbar and Queensland mainland, yet vast swathes measure less than 2 metres deep at low tide. High-resolution bathymetric surveys conducted by the Australian Hydrographic Office reveal a complex network of shallow tidal mudflats, mangrove channels, and sandbanks. This unique combination, steady southeasterly trade winds blowing across vast expanses of warm, waist-deep water, has transformed the strait into an internationally renowned venue for kiteboarding and windsurfing. Riders skim across kilometres of open water with absolute safety, knowing that if equipment fails, they can stand up on a submerged sandbank. The same winds that drove 19th-century sailing ships onto outer shoals now power high-speed ocean recreation across sheltered flats behind the barrier. The double shipwreck disaster that shamed a government into action. In November 1877, the wooden coastal steamer Gothenburg struck outer reefs of the Great Barrier Reef system during a severe cyclone, resulting in the loss of 112 lives. Barely 6 months later, the passenger vessel Loch Ard ran aground at the base of sheer limestone cliffs near Port Campbell, killing 54 people. The shock of losing nearly 200 lives in 2 catastrophic maritime incidents along southern and eastern shipping corridors within a single year exposed severe deficiencies in colonial coastal monitoring and emergency response. Public outrage forced colonial parliaments to allocate immediate funding to build stone lighthouses, install coastal telegraph lines, and equip manned rocket life-saving stations at high-risk headlands. Every modern life-saving station and automated beacon operating along the Australian coast today traces its origin back to the political crisis triggered by those twin maritime disasters in 1877 and 1878. The ancient rainforest growing on pure sand. Walk inland from coastal blowouts of Central Station on Kagari, and you enter an environment defying standard ecological principles. A dense, towering rainforest with tree canopies reaching 50 metres into the air, growing directly out of nutrient-poor, pure quartz sand. For decades, botanists were puzzled by how massive species like saturnae, hoop pine, and giant kingfern could thrive without a true clay or soil base. Scientific core sampling and soil analysis conducted by the University of Queensland solved the mystery. The forest relies on an intricate, highly efficient recycling loop powered by subterranean mycorrhizal fungi. These specialized fungi extract trace nutrients directly from decaying leaf litter on the forest floor before rainwater leaches minerals down through permeable sand. Dunes act as a physical anchor, while living biomass maintains its own self-sustaining nutrient dome high above barren quartz below. The second settlement erased from the official map. Everyone knows the historical narrative of early European settlements that flourished into modern coastal cities. Far fewer know the history of places established, fully inhabited, and then deliberately dismantled and erased from government records. During the mid-20th century, the industrial township of Wittenoom in Western Australia was home to over 8,000 residents, complete with schools, hospitals, and municipal infrastructure built around blue asbestos mining. As catastrophic health impacts of airborne asbestos fibres were confirmed by medical researchers, state authorities took unprecedented action. The government formally de-gazetted the town site, cut utilities, demolished municipal buildings, and removed the town name from official road signs and state cadastral maps. It remains one of the most stark examples on the continent of a human settlement completely removed from the geographical grid due to environmental contamination, leaving behind an empty, restricted zone where a bustling regional centre once stood. The multi-million-dollar marlin grounds on the shelf edge, where the continental shelf plunges sharply into deep oceanic water off the east coast, churning interactions of currents create one of the most productive pelagic fishing environments on Earth. The East Australian current pushes warm, nutrient-rich water right to the edge of the shelf drop-off, bringing massive shoals of baitfish, black marlin, and tuna within just a few kilometres of shoreline. Annual game fishing tournaments held out of Hervey Bay and Cairns attract international fleets, with prize pools exceeding millions of dollars for record catches. In 1953, marine scientists documented an all-tackle record black marlin weighing over 1,100 pounds caught near the shelf edge, a record demonstrating immense biological energy concentrated along this narrow oceanic boundary. Sovereign British soil buried on an Australian island. On the quiet shore of Flinders Island in Bass Strait, behind a simple timber fence, lies a tiny patch of ground maintained under a unique international protocol. It is a formal war graves site, flying the British White Ensign. In May 1942, during the height of the Second World War, German submarine activity along the Australian coast resulted in the sinking of several Allied merchant vessels. Bodies of merchant mariners and naval personnel washed ashore on isolated beaches of the Furneaux Group, where local residents provided formal burials and maintained gravesites. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission subsequently secured long-term management agreements for the land, creating a permanent piece of historical memory on a remote Tasmanian sandbar, looked after by the local island community for over 80 years. Now that we have examined scientific tools and historical records that expose these hidden coastal features, how are these dynamic sand systems and rising ocean levels reshaping the coast right now? The inland sea hiding behind the dunes. Behind barrier islands of the southern coast sits the Coorong and Gippsland Lakes network, vast estuarine systems spanning hundreds of square kilometres. The Gippsland Lakes form the largest inland network of waterways in Australia, covering approximately 600 square kilometres of shallow, sheltered water. These estuarine bodies act as critical nursery grounds for black bream, King George whiting, and commercial prawn species before they migrate into open ocean waters. During dry periods, evaporation turns shallow reaches into hypersaline pans, while heavy winter rainfall across the Great Dividing Range causes river catchments to surge toward the coast. When severe weather systems push seawater through narrow coastal entrances, the entire inland sea backs up against the mainland shore, creating complex flooding scenarios for regional agriculture and infrastructure. Shipwrecks exposed on the beach by single storms. While deep water wrecks remain permanently submerged, coastal dynamic sand movements routinely expose historic timber and iron hulls directly on public beaches along the Shipwreck Coast and Fraser Coast. At Stockton Beach in New South Wales, the massive steel hull of the MV Signa, a 53,000-ton Norwegian bulk carrier driven aground during a major storm in May 1974, remains a prominent landmark, slowly collapsing under constant wave action. Further north, severe winter swells periodically strip away 2 to 3 meters of sand from barrier beaches, temporarily revealing century-old timber ribs of forgotten coastal schooners. Local residents and heritage officers from State Park Services routinely monitor these coastal blowouts, recording structural features before prevailing winds and littoral drift bury artifacts beneath meters of quartz sand once again. The legend of the mahogany ship. Along the southwest coast of Victoria, near Warrnambool, lies one of the most enduring maritime mysteries in Australian history, the legend of the mahogany ship. Early European settlers in the 1830s reported seeing wreckage of an ancient dark timbered vessel embedded high in coastal sand dunes, constructed from wood that did not match local species. Speculation mounted for decades that the vessel represented a 16th century Portuguese or Spanish caravel that mapped the southern continent long before Dutch or British navigators arrived. Numerous searches conducted by historical societies, government surveyors, and ground-penetrating radar teams have failed to relocate the hull beneath mobile dune fields. Geological shifts and drifting sand blowouts have covered square kilometers of coastal heathland, leaving the physical existence of the hull unresolved and demonstrating how effectively moving coastal dunes can conceal massive physical structures. The coastline named after the dead it washed ashore. Along rugged limestone cliffs of the Southern Ocean, early colonial cartographers assigned grim place names reflecting the hazardous nature of coastal transit. Cape Disappointment and the Shipwreck Coast carry historical records of dozens of vessels smashed against sheer rock faces. During the 19th century, when sailing ships encountered heavy southwesterly gales, those unable to clear the lee shore were driven directly into 30-meter limestone cliffs. In many instances, bodies of drowned sailors and passengers washed ashore on isolated sand coves days after impact. Local police records and colonial survey maps from the era show coastal burial plots were established at regular intervals along clifftops, creating a quiet network of unmarked graves overlooking the ocean that claimed them. The coastal highway requiring constant rebuilding. The Great Ocean Road in Victoria, stretching over 240 kilometers along the rugged southern coast, is one of the most famous coastal drives on Earth. Constructed by returned soldiers between 1919 and 1932, the road is carved directly into crumbling marine limestone and sandstone cliffs. Because the Southern Ocean constantly undercuts cliff bases, while heavy rainfall triggers landslides from coastal ranges above, state transport authorities spend tens of millions of dollars annually on engineering interventions. Rockfall barriers, concrete seawalls, and deep soil nailing programs are required simply to keep bitumen from sliding into the ocean. Geotechnical assessments conducted by VicRoads confirm coastal erosion along specific sections averages up to 30 centimeters per year, making long-term retreat or realignment of major coastal arterial roads an inevitable reality. The island community cut off by single swells. Off the coast of South Australia, Kangaroo Island spans over 4,400 square kilometres, hosting a permanent population of over 4,000 residents. Despite its size, the island relies entirely on submarine cables, sea ferries, and regional air transport for daily connection to the mainland. When severe Southern Ocean gales roll through Investigator Strait, sea ferry services operating out of Cape Jervis are regularly suspended for days at a time. Essential supplies, fresh food, fuel, and medical transports are brought to a complete standstill until wave heights drop below operational thresholds. The single submarine power cable connecting the island grid to the mainland experienced major faults in recent years, forcing local energy providers to deploy emergency diesel generation plants while specialized cable repair vessels worked in heavy offshore swells. The silent subsurface battleground of the Tasman Sea. During 1942 and 1943, Japanese imperial submarines operated extensively along the Australian eastern seaboard, launching covert attacks on merchant shipping corridors between Sydney, Brisbane, and Newcastle. Over 30 Allied merchant ships were torpedoed or shelled within sight of the mainland coast, resulting in the loss of hundreds of lives. The Australian government imposed strict censorship on news reports to prevent widespread public panic in coastal cities, leaving local residents to watch burning vessels on the horizon without official confirmation. Today, marine survey vessels equipped with advanced side-scan sonar continue to discover undisturbed hulls of these wartime losses resting in deep water along the edge of the continental shelf. The ghost town preserved in desert dunes. Far inland from coastal surf, in the arid interior of Western Australia, sits the ghost town of Gwalia. Established during 1890s gold rushes, the settlement once housed thousands of miners working deep underground shafts of the Sons of Gwalia mine. When commercial operations ceased in the mid-20th century, the population departed almost overnight, leaving behind fully furnished timber and corrugated iron cottages. The dry desert atmosphere and drifting red sand dunes preserved the town site in a remarkable state of suspended animation. Managed today as a historical precinct, Gwalia offers a snapshot of early Australian mining architecture, standing empty on the edge of a massive, dormant, open-cut pit. The oldest continuous human record on Earth. Across the Australian continent, First Nations oral traditions contain detailed geographical accounts, scientifically verified by modern geomorphology. Along the Queensland coast and Torres Strait, Indigenous oral histories describe specific islands connected to the mainland by dry land, followed by a period of rising sea levels that flooded coastal plains. Geological dating of sea level changes following the last glacial maximum confirms these coastal land bridges were submerged between 7,000 and 10,000 years ago. Oral records maintained by traditional owners accurately describe the positioning of ancient river channels, hunting grounds, and coastlines that now sit 20 meters below sea level. It represents the oldest continuous, scientifically verifiable oral record of geographic change anywhere on the planet, preserving human memory across thousands of years of shifting sea levels. The continent is moving north. Underneath localized sand movement, coastal erosion, and rising sea levels sits a fundamental tectonic reality. The entire Australian continent is moving. Driven by plate tectonic forces, the Indo-Australian plate is sliding northward toward Asia at approximately 7 centimeters per year. While 7 centimeters sounds small, it represents the fastest movement of any continental plate on Earth. Over a human lifespan, the continent moves nearly 5 meters northward. This rapid shift creates measurable discrepancies for high-precision satellite navigation systems, requiring Geoscience Australia to formally update national spatial coordinates to align spatial maps with physical location. Sand dunes walk across the coast, the ocean undercuts limestone cliffs, and the entire continental plate slides northward across the mantle, a quiet motion carrying everything built upon it along for the ride. What kept these coastal anomalies hidden for so long was not a lack of observation, but a foundational assumption of colonial cartography, the belief that a coast, once surveyed and drawn on a map sheet, remains static. Colonial hydrographers and land surveyors approached the Australian edge as if framed in permanent granite, treating sandbanks, barrier islands, and shifting tidal inlets as fixed geometries bounded by a single black ink line. Yet as we have seen from shifting dunes of K'gari to drowned sea passages of Bass Strait, the Australian coast is not a static line. It is a slow-motion geological event occurring across thousands of kilometres and tens of thousands of years. Much of this dynamic landscape remains unresolved. Marine hydrographers from Geoscience Australia estimate less than 25% of Australia's vast maritime exclusive economic zone has been mapped using high-resolution multi-beam sonar. Submerged indigenous archaeological sites, ancient river channels flooded during the last glacial sea level rise, and undiscovered deep-water shipwrecks lie beneath coastal waves, quietly buried or exposed as offshore sands shift. Official maps published by state mapping agencies give the illusion of a finished, settled continent. But beneath cartographic grids and cadastral boundaries, the physical ground continues to slide, erode, and rebuild itself on its own deep time schedule. Which feature along your own state or territory coastline has always struck you as unusually strange or out of place? Or which item on this list surprised you most? Share your local knowledge in the comments below, and consider subscribing to join us for our next geographical investigation.